The late autumn wind whistled through the gaps in Virginia City's weathered buildings, carrying the bite of approaching winter. Hannah Lewis pulled her threadbare shawl tighter as she hurried down the muddy street toward the Golden Nugget, the saloon where she'd worked these past 3 years. At 22, her face still held traces of youthful beauty, though worry had etched fine lines around her eyes. Her younger sister Grace waited at home with their ailing mother, unaware of the desperate bargain Hannah had struck with John Wright, the saloon's owner. Inside the Golden Nugget's smoky interior, Hannah's heart sank as she spotted Wright in his usual corner, his cold eyes following her movements. The man had built an empire of flesh trade along the territorial border, using the saloon as a front for darker enterprises. When Hannah had begged him for an advance on her wages to pay for her mother's medicine, his counter-proposal had made her blood run cold. Grace's services as payment for the debt. At the bar, Matthew Harris nursed a whiskey, his gaunt frame and hollow cough marking him as one of the many consumptives who'd sought the dry air of the territories. Unlike the others, Harris carried matched Colts with pearl handles, and even in his weakened state, men gave him a wide berth. Hannah had seen him watching her these past weeks with an unreadable expression, though he'd never approached or spoken a word. The saloon's usual evening bustle was interrupted by the arrival of David Young, Wright's enforcer. The brutish man's presence sent a ripple of tension through the room as he made his way to Hannah, gripping her arm roughly. "Time's up, girl. Boss says bring your sister tomorrow night. No more delays." His whispered threats carried the weight of past violence, making Hannah's knees weak with fear. Matthew Harris's chair scraped back suddenly, drawing every eye in the room. The consumptive gunfighter rose slowly, deliberate as a rattler uncoiling. "Miss Lewis seems disinclined to accept your proposition," he said, his soft voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Hannah stared at him in shock. She'd never told anyone her surname, yet he knew it. Young's face twisted with contempt as he sized up the sickly gunman. "This ain't your business, Harris. Everyone knows you're 1 foot in the grave already." But his hand had dropped from Hannah's arm, and there was uncertainty in his stance. Harris's reputation clearly meant something, even here in Virginia City's lawless streets. "I'm making it my business," Harris replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Consider it a dying man's prerogative." His words sparked murmurs through the crowd. Matthew Harris's exploits were legend along the border, though few knew what had driven him to his current state of exile and illness. Wright emerged from his corner, his businessman's facade firmly in place. "Now, gentlemen, surely we can discuss this civilized-like." Miss Lewis entered into this arrangement of her own free will. "We simply expect her to honor her obligations." His reasonable tone couldn't disguise the steel beneath, or the fact that 4 of his men had quietly positioned themselves around the room. Hannah found her voice at last. "I never agreed to sell my sister. I asked for an advance on wages I'd already earned." She looked desperately at Harris, wondering why this stranger would risk himself for her family. His eyes met hers briefly, and she saw something there, recognition perhaps, or shared pain. The tension stretched like an over-tightened fiddle string, ready to snap into violence at any moment. Then Harris coughed, a wet, racking sound that spattered his handkerchief with blood. Yet his gun hand remained steady as he addressed Wright. "I'm buying out the lady's debt. Name your price." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Wright's calculating gaze shifted between Harris and Hannah, measuring angles and opportunities. $5,000. Cash. The exorbitant sum made Hannah gasp. It was more than she could earn in 10 years of honest work. But Harris simply nodded, reaching into his coat with his free hand. To everyone's amazement, he produced a bank draft for the full amount. "Payable at the Virginia City Bank. I believe you'll find it in order." Wright examined the paper carefully, then nodded to Young to stand down. Hannah felt tears of relief welling in her eyes, though uncertainty still gripped her. Why would a dying man spend such a sum on strangers? As the crowd began to disperse, Harris turned to Hannah. "Gather your sister and mother. Be ready to leave town by midnight." His voice was gentle but brooked no argument. "Wright won't honor this bargain any longer than he must, and I've just made myself an inconvenient obstacle to his business interests." Hannah hurried home through darkening streets, her mind whirling with questions. Grace met her at the door, their mother's fever having finally broken enough for the girl to leave her bedside. Looking at her sister's innocent face, Hannah shuddered at how close she'd come to losing her to Wright's evil, but Harris's intervention had bought them a chance, if they were brave enough to take it. The night air carried the metallic scent of an approaching storm as Hannah rushed through their modest home, hastily stuffing necessities into worn carpet bags. Her fingers trembled as she folded Grace's few dresses, remembering Harris's urgent warning. Their mother stirred weakly on her bed, the laudanum finally wearing off enough for her to track Hannah's movements with fever-bright eyes. "We can't stay here, Mother," Hannah explained softly, helping the frail woman sit up. "That man Wright, he'll come looking once he realizes what's happened. Harris bought us time, but we have to use it wisely." She didn't mention how the gunfighter's hollow cough and sallow complexion suggested he'd purchased their freedom with what remained of his own life. Grace appeared in the doorway, clutching their mother's medicine box. "I heard riders coming up from the saloon," she whispered, her young face pinched with worry. "3 men, moving slow, like they're searching." Hannah's heart stuttered. Wright's men were already combing the streets, no doubt hoping to catch them before they could flee. Thunder rolled across the valley as Hannah helped her mother dress in layers against the coming rain. The woman's skin burned beneath Hannah's touch, but there was no choice. They had to move now, while darkness and the storm provided cover. Grace tied back her long hair and donned boys' clothes Hannah had stolen from the boarding house laundry, the better to disguise her if they were spotted. "We'll head south," Hannah decided, recalling Harris's earlier words about Wright's connections reaching throughout Virginia City and the surrounding territories. "There's a mission near Santa Fe where Mother can recover properly." She didn't voice her fears about making such a grueling journey with a sick woman and young girl in tow, nor about the dangers that lurked along the border territories. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by male voices calling to each other in the street. Hannah extinguished their single lamp and peered through a gap in the curtains. Lightning illuminated 3 of Wright's men moving house to house, their faces hard in the brief flash. She recognized Andrew, the cruel-eyed enforcer who'd manhandled Grace at the auction. "Out the back," Hannah breathed, guiding her mother's trembling steps, while Grace gathered their meager belongings. The rain began in earnest as they slipped through the rear door into the muddy alley. Hannah silently thanked God for the storm's timely arrival. It would help cover their tracks and muffle any sounds of their escape. They made their way carefully through the warren of back streets, Hannah supporting their mother while Grace followed close behind. Twice they had to press themselves into shadowy doorways as search parties passed nearby. The rain plastered their clothes to their bodies and Hannah could feel her mother shaking with fever and fatigue. Near the edge of town, a figure materialized from the darkness, causing Hannah to stifle a scream. It was Harris, leading 3 saddled horses. "Wright's men are watching the stage depot and livery," he said, without preamble, helping them mount. "Head southeast until you hit the old Mission Trail, then follow it to Santa Fe. Don't stop until you're well clear of Virginia City's reach." "Why are you helping us?" Hannah asked as she settled her mother in front of her on the saddle. Lightning revealed the gunfighter's gaunt face, and she saw something like peace in his tired eyes. "Because some debts can only be paid forward," he replied cryptically. "Now ride, and don't look back no matter what you hear." As they urged their horses into the storm-swept night, shots rang out behind them. Hannah resisted the urge to turn, focusing instead on keeping her mother secure and Grace's horse close beside them. The thunder swallowed any further gunfire, but she imagined she could hear Harris's voice carried on the wind. "Ride hard and God go with you." The rain-slick trail stretched ahead into darkness as they fled south, leaving Virginia City and its corruption behind. But Hannah knew Wright wouldn't let them escape easily. His reputation and profits depended on making examples of those who defied him. Their journey was just beginning, and the coming days would test their courage and determination to remain free. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the Santa Fe Saloon, as Hannah Lewis watched her younger sister Rebecca being led away in shackles. The human traffickers from the King family's operation moved with practiced efficiency, their boots clicking against the wooden floorboards. Hannah's fingers trembled around her empty whiskey glass as she fought back tears, knowing their mother's mounting medical bills had forced this desperate choice. Matthew Wright leaned against the bar, his gaunt frame racked by another bout of coughing. The consumption was eating away at his lungs, but his keen eyes didn't miss the raw anguish on Hannah's face. He'd seen enough suffering in his 35 years as a gunfighter to recognize true desperation. Despite his weakened condition, something about the scene awakened a final ember of purpose in his dying heart. The saloon's proprietor, John King, emerged from his office wearing an oily smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He made a show of counting out silver dollars onto the bar in front of Hannah, payment for her sister, minus their mother's accumulated debt. Hannah's hand shook as she reached for the coins, but King's enforcer Michael Harris slapped her fingers away with a sneer. "Transaction's not complete until the merchandise crosses the border," Harris growled. "You'll get your cut once she's delivered to our buyers in Laredo." He gestured to his men, who roughly guided Rebecca toward the door. The 16-year-old girl's face was streaked with silent tears, but she held her head high, refusing to break down completely in front of her tormentors. Matthew's shrewd gaze took in the positions of King's men, 4 total, all armed but overconfident in their authority. His own Colt revolver hung heavy on his hip, unused for months as his illness had progressed. But muscle memory died harder than flesh, and his trigger finger still itched with deadly purpose. He began formulating a plan, knowing he had nothing left to lose. That night, Hannah paced her small room above the saloon, wondering if she could somehow follow her sister's captors south. But King's men would be watching, and she had no horse, no weapons, no real hope of mounting a rescue alone. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. When she opened it, Matthew Wright stood in the shadows of the hallway, his hollow cheeks flushed with fever. "I know a way to save her," Matthew whispered hoarsely. "But we'll need help. Someone with contacts along the border who can track King's operation. There's a woman named Victoria Young who runs a way station outside town. She helps girls escape the trade routes. If we can reach her by morning, we might have a chance." Hannah studied the dying gunfighter's face, seeing both determination and desperation in his feverish eyes. She knew his reputation, a notorious pistolero in his day, though disease had forced him into retirement. Even diminished, he radiated lethal competence. "Why would you help us?" she asked warily. Matthew's bitter laugh dissolved into racking coughs. When he could speak again, his voice was raw with emotion. "My sister died in a place like Laredo, sold to men like King. I was too young, too far away to save her then. But I'm not powerless now, not yet. Consider this my last confession, my final chance to balance the scales before the consumption claims me." They slipped out of town before dawn, borrowing horses from the livery where Hannah had befriended the stable boy. Matthew rode hunched in his saddle, each hoofbeat jarring his ravaged lungs, but his determination never wavered. Hannah found herself watching him with a mixture of concern and growing respect. Here was a man facing death, yet choosing to spend his remaining strength helping strangers. Victoria Young's way station proved to be a fortified ranch house surrounded by high adobe walls. The woman herself was a striking figure, tall, silver-haired, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darkness. She listened to their story without interruption, then nodded grimly. "King's outfit moves girls through here regularly. I know their routes, their safe houses. But crossing them means war." "War's coming anyway," Matthew replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "King's empire is built on suffering. How many more sisters and daughters disappear into his trade? Sometimes dying well matters more than living long." His words sparked something in Victoria's eyes, recognition of a kindred spirit perhaps, or simple appreciation for his willingness to fight despite his condition. Victoria's network of informants brought word that Rebecca's group was headed for a remote ranch near the border, where merchandise was held until buyers arrived from Mexico. The operation was well guarded, but Victoria knew the terrain and the patrol patterns. She also introduced them to David Lewis, no relation to Hannah, but a former Texas Ranger who'd dedicated himself to fighting the slave trade after his own daughter vanished. They spent 2 days planning, gathering supplies and additional allies from Victoria's underground railroad of reformed outlaws and vengeful survivors. Matthew's condition worsened, but he refused all suggestions that he stay behind. Hannah found herself drawn to his quiet strength, even as she worried each rattling breath might be his last. They shared stories during the long nights, building a fragile connection neither dared name. The rescue party moved out under cover of darkness, a dozen riders carrying enough weapons and ammunition for a small war. Victoria's intelligence proved accurate. They located the ranch just as a group of Mexican buyers arrived to examine the merchandise. The timing couldn't have been better. With the compound's attention focused on the transaction, they had their chance to strike. The attack began with calculated precision, but quickly descended into chaos as gunfire erupted across the moonlit ranch. Matthew positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the compound, his experienced eye guiding their sharpshooters, while Hannah and Victoria crept toward the slave pens. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with desert sage as muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies. David Lewis led the main assault, his years of Texas Ranger tactics proving invaluable as they systematically cut through the ranch's defenses. The Mexican buyers scattered, leaving their would-be purchases and a fortune in gold behind. But the trafficking ring's enforcers stood their ground with the desperate violence of men who knew the hangman's noose awaited if they surrendered. Inside the compound, Hannah's heart nearly stopped when she found Rebecca's empty cage. Victoria grabbed her arm before she could scream, pointing to fresh boot prints leading toward the stables. They followed the trail, ducking between adobe walls as bullets chipped away at the corners. The night air grew thick with dust and gun smoke, making Hannah's eyes water as they pressed forward. Matthew's racking cough gave away his position, drawing enemy fire. He rolled away from the ridge's edge, blood speckling his lips, but managed to take down 2 more guards before they could flank David's position. His fever burned hot enough to feel through his shirt, yet his hands remained steady on his rifle. Each shot found its mark with lethal precision. In the stables, Hannah and Victoria discovered Rebecca, along with 3 other girls being hustled toward waiting horses by a well-dressed man Hannah recognized from the saloon, Michael Andrews, one of the town's most respected businessmen. His genteel facade cracked as he raised a derringer, but Victoria was faster. Her knife found his throat before he could pull the trigger. The girls huddled together, terrified and half-starved, but alive. Hannah embraced her sister while Victoria cut their bonds, all of them flinching at the continued gunfire outside. Rebecca's whispered account of her captivity made Hannah's blood run cold. Andrews wasn't just a buyer, but one of the ring's primary organizers. His ledgers would implicate dozens of supposedly upstanding citizens. David's voice rang out above the chaos, calling for surrender. The remaining guards threw down their weapons, more afraid of the former ranger's reputation than their employer's retribution. As dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, the full scope of their victory became clear. Not only had they rescued Rebecca and the others, but they'd stumbled onto evidence that could bring down trafficking operations across 3 territories. Matthew collapsed as they regrouped, the night's exertion finally overwhelming his failing body. Hannah cradled his head while Victoria rode for the doctor, though they all knew it was likely too late. He smiled up at her through blood-flecked lips, managing to whisper, "Worth it," before losing consciousness. His breathing grew shallow but steadied as Hannah refused to let him go. The ride back to Laredo was tense, every shadow potentially hiding vengeful pursuers. Rebecca rode double with Hannah, her sister's arms wrapped protectively around her waist. David led them along back trails, avoiding the main roads where news of the raid would have already spread. The trafficking ring's surviving members would be desperate to silence any witnesses, especially those who knew their true identities. Victoria split off toward Santa Fe with Andrew's ledgers and half their fighters as escort, hoping to reach the federal marshals before the ring's political connections could bury the evidence. The rest of their party pushed on toward Laredo, where Grace, a widow who ran a secret way station for escaped slaves, had promised sanctuary. But Hannah knew their troubles were far from over. Too many powerful men stood to lose everything if the truth came out. Matthew drifted in and out of consciousness, burning with fever, yet refusing to quit. Each mile seemed to drain more life from him, but his determination to see the girls to safety gave him strength to continue. Hannah found herself praying for the first time in years, begging God to let him live long enough to witness the good he'd helped accomplish. She wasn't ready to lose him, not when she'd finally found someone worth loving. The abandoned church outside Laredo cast long shadows in the setting sun, as Matthew Harris crouched behind a weathered headstone, his racking cough muffled by a bandana. Through watering eyes, he watched Rebecca and Hannah Young being hustled into the decaying building by John King's men. The sisters' attempted escape from Laredo had ended barely 10 miles out when King's riders caught up to them. Now Matthew had tracked them here, to this desolate outpost where King's human trafficking operation did its darkest business. The sound of horses approaching sent Matthew deeper into the shadows of a crumbling angel statue. David Wright, King's second-in-command, dismounted near the church steps, his spurs jangling ominously in the desert quiet. Matthew's hand instinctively went to his Colt, but he forced himself to wait. With his failing health, he'd get one chance at this. It had to count. He watched Wright disappear inside, where candlelight now flickered through broken windows. Inside the church, Hannah struggled against the ropes binding her wrists as Wright circled her and Rebecca like a hungry wolf. "You girls caused quite a stir running off like that," he drawled, pausing to light a cigar. "Mr. King's already got buyers lined up in Santa Fe expecting fresh merchandise tomorrow. Your little adventures put us behind schedule." Rebecca met his gaze with defiant eyes, though Matthew could see her trembling from his vantage point through a gap in the rotting boards. The sound of approaching wagons drew Wright to the window, and Matthew seized his chance. Slipping through a side door, he positioned himself behind a fallen beam, controlling his breathing to suppress another coughing fit. He could hear more of King's men arriving outside, at least half a dozen by the sound of it. The odds were getting worse by the minute. Through the haze of dust motes dancing in the fading sunlight, Matthew saw Rebecca notice his presence. Her eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other sign. "Time to move out," Wright announced, gesturing to his men. "Get them in the wagon." As two thugs approached the sisters, Matthew erupted from his hiding place, his first shot taking Wright's cigar, and most of his jaw, clean off. The second dropped one of the approaching men before they could even register where the shots had come from. Rebecca immediately threw herself sideways, knocking Hannah clear of the gunfire that erupted through the church. Matthew's tuberculosis-weakened lungs screamed as he dove behind an overturned pew, bullets splintering the wood around him. Through the chaos, he saw Rebecca working frantically to free Hannah's bonds. Another of Wright's men appeared in the doorway, but Matthew's shot caught him center mass before he could level his weapon. The remaining thugs were falling back, seeking cover behind the altar and what remained of the church's support columns. Outside, more gunfire erupted as Michael Young, the sister's cousin who Matthew had enlisted for backup, engaged the men by the wagons. The distraction gave Matthew the opening he needed. Rising from cover, he charged forward, guns blazing. Two more of Wright's men fell, but a bullet caught Matthew high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He managed to keep his feet, using the momentum to wheel and fire again, dropping another attacker. Rebecca had gotten Hannah free, and the sisters were making their way toward the back of the church. But King himself had arrived, standing framed in the doorway with a shotgun. "Quite a performance, Harris," he called out, keeping the weapon trained on the sisters. "But it ends now. Drop the gun or I paint these walls with young blood." Matthew's arms felt like lead, his vision blurring from pain and exhaustion. The choice seemed impossible. Surrender meant death for all of them, but any attempt to shoot would likely get the sisters killed. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As King's attention focused on Matthew, Hannah suddenly hurled a heavy brass candlestick, striking the shotgun barrel upward just as King fired. The blast took out part of the ceiling, raining debris down. In that chaos, Rebecca tackled her sister aside as Matthew's final shot caught King square in the chest. The crime lord's expression of surprise remained frozen on his face as he toppled backward through the doorway. Michael Young's voice rang out from outside. "It's done! The rest are either dead or running." Matthew sagged against a wall, his strength finally giving out as the sisters rushed to his side. Blood soaked his shirt, and the familiar copper taste in his mouth told him his disease-ravaged lungs were failing. But as Rebecca gripped his hand, tears in her eyes, he managed a weak smile. He'd done what he set out to do, given these innocent souls a chance at freedom, even if it cost him what little time he had left. The aftermath unfolded like a fever dream. More riders arrived, honest men this time, summoned by Michael Young. John King's trafficking empire began crumbling within hours, as arrests were made across 3 territories. His network of corrupt officials and business partners scattered like roaches in lamplight, taking their secrets with them. But they no longer controlled Laredo or the sisters' fate. Matthew Harris lived just long enough to see Hannah and Rebecca safely settled with relatives in Virginia City, where they would help other survivors of King's operation build new lives. The late summer winds carried dust through Laredo's streets as Rebecca stood at Matthew's freshly dug grave, her sister Hannah clutching her arm. The simple wooden cross bore no epitaph, just his name and the date. It seemed insufficient for a man who'd sacrificed everything to save them, but Rebecca knew his true memorial lived in the lives he'd changed. Around them, other survivors of King's operation gathered, heads bowed in respect for the tubercular gunfighter who dealt the first decisive blow against their captors. Michael Young had kept his word, using Matthew's final testimony to build an airtight case against the trafficking ring. But even as justice ground forward through the territorial courts, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that some of King's associates remained hidden in plain sight, waiting to rebuild their operation. She'd seen too many familiar faces vanish into the crowd during the initial raids, too many ledgers and documents mysteriously destroyed before investigators could examine them. The sisters' new life in Virginia City brought its own challenges. Their Aunt Victoria's boarding house became a sanctuary for women escaping similar circumstances. But running such an establishment drew unwanted attention. Anonymous threats arrived weekly, notes slipped under doors, whispered warnings from strangers in the street. Rebecca took to carrying Matthew's old revolver, though she prayed she'd never need to use it. Hannah focused on helping the newest arrivals adjust, her gentle spirit providing comfort to those still haunted by their ordeals. One rain-soaked evening, a mud-splattered rider arrived with news that chilled Rebecca's blood. John King had escaped custody during transfer between jurisdictions, leaving 3 marshals dead in his wake. The sisters spent that night barricading doors and windows, knowing it was only a matter of time before he sought revenge against those who'd testified against him. Victoria insisted they flee further north, but Rebecca refused to abandon the women who'd come to depend on them. Their vigilance paid off 2 weeks later when David, one of Michael's deputies, spotted King's right-hand man Andrew skulking near the boarding house stables. The ensuing gunfight left Andrew dead and revealed documents detailing King's plan to re-establish his operation in Santa Fe. More importantly, it exposed a network of sympathizers within Virginia City itself, including several prominent businessmen who'd presented themselves as allies in the fight against trafficking. The revelations forced Rebecca to make an impossible choice. She could remain in Virginia City, protecting the boarding house but risking eventual discovery by King's supporters. Or she could take Matthew's final gift, a chance at a truly free life, and start fresh elsewhere with Hannah. Her sister, showing wisdom beyond her years, reminded Rebecca that sometimes the bravest choice was knowing when to step back and let others carry on the fight. As autumn painted the mountains gold, the sisters bid farewell to Victoria and their charges, entrusting the sanctuary's operation to Grace, a former saloon girl whose steel-spined determination reminded Rebecca of herself. They joined a wagon train bound for California, where Michael had arranged new identities through his contacts in the U.S. Marshal's office. Behind them, Virginia City's honest citizens, enlightened by the scandal, began the slow work of rooting out corruption and establishing legitimate aid for trafficking survivors. Word reached them in Amarillo that John King had been cornered and killed in a shootout near the Mexican border, but Rebecca knew better than to believe his death meant the end of such enterprises. The world that had allowed men like him to prosper still existed, its shadows offering shelter to those who would prey on the desperate and vulnerable. Yet she found hope in the small victories. Each woman who reclaimed her freedom, each corrupt official exposed, each life rebuilt from the ashes of exploitation. Hannah sometimes spoke of Matthew, wondering if he'd known how far-reaching the consequences of his actions would be. Rebecca believed he had, that in his final days, he'd seen beyond his own redemption to a future where others might never face the choices they had. His sacrifice had sparked a chain reaction, turning victims into advocates and bystanders into champions of justice. In that way, she realized, he'd achieved a kind of immortality more meaningful than mere survival. The sisters' journey continued westward, carrying with them the lessons of Laredo and Virginia City. They understood now that freedom wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about forging new links of support and solidarity, about transforming personal deliverance into collective liberation. Though Matthew's grave lay far behind them, his spirit lived on in their determination to help others find their way to safety, one soul at a time. The first rays of dawn crept over the hills surrounding Santa Fe as Matthew Lewis led his ragtag group through the narrow canyon. His chest burned with each labored breath, but he pressed on, knowing time was running out, both for young Grace Harris and for himself. Behind him rode Hannah Harris, clutching her borrowed Winchester, followed by the unlikely allies they'd gathered. Andrew Wright, a reformed card sharp whose conscience had finally got the better of him, and Rebecca Young, a widowed rancher who'd lost her own daughter to the trafficking ring years before. The King brothers' compound lay ahead, a sprawling collection of adobe buildings where David King ran his operation under the guise of a legitimate trading post. Intelligence from Andrew suggested Grace was being held in the cellar beneath the main house, awaiting transport to buyers in Mexico. Matthew's tubercular cough had worsened in the cold morning air, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to give away their position now. Hannah's face was a mask of determination as she dismounted beside Matthew. "We go in quiet," she whispered, her saloon girl's charm replaced by steel. "Rebecca, you and Andrew circle around back. When you hear the shots start, get to that cellar and find Grace." Matthew nodded approval, impressed by how naturally Hannah had taken to planning their rescue mission. Her sister's kidnapping had awakened something in her, a strength she perhaps hadn't known she possessed. Inside the compound, John King's men were changing guard shifts, the perfect moment to strike. Matthew and Hannah crept forward through shadows, while their companions disappeared around the building's far side. They'd almost reached the front door when a sentry's boot scuffed on stone. Matthew's draw was lightning fast despite his illness, his Colt clearing leather before the guard could level his shotgun. The blast echoed off canyon walls like thunder. All hell broke loose as King's men poured from the buildings, guns blazing. Matthew and Hannah dove behind a water trough as bullets splintered wood around them. Through the chaos, they heard Rebecca's rifle crack from the rear of the compound. The plan was working. The defenders' attention split between front and back attacks. Matthew's revolvers sang a deadly duet as he provided covering fire, each shot finding its mark despite hands that shook from fever. In the compound's rear courtyard, Andrew Wright had located the cellar entrance. His lockpicks made short work of the heavy padlock while Rebecca kept watch. The sound of gunfire provided perfect cover as they descended the steep stairs into darkness. A single lantern illuminated the cramped space where they found Grace Harris and 3 other captive women huddled in a corner. "We're getting you out," Andrew assured them, his practiced gambler's calm settling their fears. David King himself appeared on the compound's upper balcony, a Winchester in his hands. Hannah's shot caught him in the shoulder before he could aim, sending him stumbling back through a doorway. Matthew seized the moment to lead a charge across the courtyard, though each running step felt like knives in his lungs. They had to reach the main house before King could rally his remaining men or sound an alarm to bring reinforcements from town. The rescue party converged on the house's rear exit, just as Andrew emerged from the cellar with the freed captives. Grace flew into her sister's arms with a sob of relief, while Rebecca herded the other women toward the waiting horses. But their escape route was suddenly blocked by John King and his remaining gunmen, who'd circled around from the front. Matthew stepped forward, placing himself between the Kings and their former prisoners. His chest heaved as he raised his Colts. "It ends here," Matthew declared, blood flecking his lips as he confronted the brothers who'd built their fortune on human misery. David King emerged from the house clutching his wounded shoulder, rage twisting his features. "You're dying anyway, Lewis," he snarled. "Walk away now. We'll even let you keep breathing till the consumption takes you." Matthew's response was a bitter laugh. "That's why I'm perfect for this job. Nothing left to lose." The final gunfight erupted like a summer storm, brief, violent, and cleansing. When silence fell again, both King brothers lay dead along with their loyal guards. Matthew had taken 2 bullets but remained standing through sheer will. Hannah and Rebecca got the freed women mounted double while Andrew collected weapons and ammunition. They had to move fast. The shots would bring every corrupt lawman in Santa Fe running to investigate. The escape from the compound was a blur of pounding hooves and shouted warnings as other gang members emerged from town to give chase. Matthew brought up the rear, every breath agony as he picked off pursuers one by one. His final act would be ensuring these women reached safety. A redemption of sorts for a life lived largely in shadow. Hannah glanced back often, concern evident in her eyes. She'd seen past his gunfighter's reputation to the dying man, determined to do one last good thing. They rode hard through the day, making for Rebecca's isolated ranch where the freed women would be safe until transport could be arranged to their homes. As dusk approached, Matthew finally slumped in his saddle, strength fading. Hannah and Grace helped ease him down by a stream where he could rest. "Thank you," Hannah whispered, gripping his hand. "You gave my sister back to me." Matthew managed a weak smile. "Been waiting my whole life to do something that mattered." Glad I lived long enough. In the end, Matthew Lewis passed peacefully that night beneath desert stars, surrounded by those he'd helped save. Hannah buried him on a hilltop overlooking Rebecca's ranch, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. In the years that followed, she and Grace would often visit, leaving flowers for the dying gunfighter who'd found redemption in becoming their unlikely guardian angel. His sacrifice had not only reunited their family but helped break the trafficking ring's power in the territory, leading to its eventual destruction. The Harris sisters remained at Rebecca's ranch, helping her create a sanctuary for other women escaping abuse and exploitation. Andrew Wright became their trusted friend and protector, finding his own redemption in honest work. The story of their stand against the Kings became legend in Santa Fe, whispered in saloons and around campfires, not as a tale of violence, but as proof that even in the darkest corners of the frontier, hope and justice could still prevail if good people found the courage to stand together. The years following Hannah and Grace's ordeal brought both healing and purpose. The sisters transformed Rebecca's ranch into more than just a sanctuary. It became a symbol of hope across the territory. They named it Victoria's Haven, after their mother, whose illness had set their story in motion. The sprawling adobe buildings, once a simple homestead, now housed dozens of women rebuilding their lives away from the shadow of exploitation. Hannah discovered she had a gift for teaching, starting a small schoolroom where the women learned to read and write, skills that had often been denied them. Grace's experience in the saloons proved unexpectedly valuable. She knew how to spot the signs of trafficking and helped local lawmen identify and rescue other victims. The sisters' work spread beyond Santa Fe, creating a network of safe houses stretching from Amarillo to Laredo. Andrew Wright, true to his word, remained their steadfast ally. He trained other men who shared their cause, forming a protective circle around the sanctuary. These weren't gunslingers seeking glory, but quiet professionals who understood that true strength lay in prevention rather than violence. The ranch became known as a place where both victims and reformed outlaws could find redemption. Rebecca's medical skills grew renowned throughout the territory. She treated not only the women at the sanctuary but also travelers and townspeople who couldn't afford proper care. Her gentle hands and kind words healed more than just physical wounds, helping restore dignity to those who'd had it stripped away. The ranch's reputation even reached Virginia City, where other communities began modeling similar refuges. The King's former empire crumbled piece by piece. Without their network of corrupted officials and intimidated townspeople, their remaining operations withered. Some fled south across the border, while others faced justice in territorial courts. The sisters testified at several trials, their courage inspiring other victims to come forward. The days of open human trafficking in the border territories were numbered, yet the greatest changes were personal. Hannah no longer started at sudden noises or kept a gun beneath her pillow. Grace learned to trust again, eventually finding love with a young rancher who understood and supported their mission. Together, they proved that the frontier's harshness could be tempered by compassion and community. They never forgot the tubercular gunfighter who'd made it all possible. Every year on the anniversary of his death, the sanctuary held a quiet ceremony on the hilltop. Women who'd found shelter there would share stories of their own guardians. The strangers who'd helped them escape, the families who'd hidden them, the lawmen who'd looked the other way to ensure their safety. The Harris sisters' legacy grew beyond their own lifetimes. Their story became more than just a tale of rescue. It demonstrated how darkness could be overcome not through violence alone, but through the persistent light of human kindness. The sanctuary continued long after they were gone, a living testament to the power of choosing hope over fear, redemption over revenge. In time, the border territories changed, laws strengthened, towns grew more civilized, and the old ways of exploitation became increasingly difficult. But Victoria's Haven remained, adapting to new challenges while holding true to its founding principles. The wooden cross on the hilltop weathered and aged, yet flowers still appeared beneath it, left by those who understood that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage come from those with the least left to lose. The frontier had taught Hannah and Grace harsh lessons about human nature, but it had also shown them humanity's capacity for change. Their mother's illness, which had once threatened to destroy their family, had ultimately led to the salvation of countless others. In the end, they discovered that even in the wildest territories, justice could grow from the seeds of sacrifice, and hope could flourish in the most barren soil.